It's time to do one of my favorite videos of the year, and that is of course my almost traditional now driver rankings. I think I've done this maybe 3 or 4 years in a row, so it's always really fun to kind of look back on years and how I saw drivers, last year, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, and yeah, it's a video that I'm very much enjoyed doing. Now, as always, this tier list will be linked in the description box down below, so if you want to go and do it yourself, then definitely go and check it out. Now, in terms of the tiers, as always, they are pretty self-explanatory. The only thing that I always say, the caveat that I have in terms of how I judge drivers is that I don't necessarily just judge what the drivers have done over the past year. I kind of look at it over the past 2 seasons because I think it kind of allows me to take just a little bit of recency bias away, and also it just allows me to weight the drivers, in my opinion, a little bit fairer, because there's certain drivers, for example, that might have had an amazing season last year and that don't quite have as good of a car this year, but are still driving at a very decent level, and so it just allows me to have that balance. So anyway, as always, let's get into it. So here we are, the 2024 tier list. Now, I must say this year is a very unique one because in a 20 driver championship, we have had 23 drivers in 2024. And I must be honest, I actually found putting together this tier list a lot harder than last year because of so many kind of anomalies when it comes to drivers. And we're going to begin basically with one of them straight away, and that is Ollie Bearman. Now, again, when you're talking about a driver who has 3 race starts, but has impressed kind of in 2 out of 3 of those, and is so young and hasn't actually kind of started his F1 career full time, it is so difficult to judge. But I think I'm going to put, because he has impressed, I'm going to put him in solid but replaceable. I feel like I don't want to kind of overrate him just yet. I feel like solid but replaceable is a pretty kind of, it's a good starting point, especially for a rookie, by the way. I mean, when we're talking about someone who next year is going to go into their full, first full season of Formula One, to be at that tier list with some of the drivers that are going to be in it, as you'll see, I think that's a good start for Ollie. That's kind of where I feel he is at the moment after 3 races. As we saw in Brazil, he's nowhere near the finished article. He will, he still has a lot of learning to do, but yeah, he is a massively talented driver, as we saw in both his Ferrari one-off and also, of course, in Baku as well, scoring back-to-back points for back-to-back teams in his first 2 races. Next up, we have Nico Hülkenberg. Pretty simple. I'm going to put him in quality midfield drivers. I mean, what a renaissance this guy has had. I mean, last year, I think he surprised a lot of people last year with his return back to Formula One with Haas, and this year he's just built upon that. At the moment, in terms of kind of that fight between the bottom half of the midfield, he is currently best of the rest, a few points ahead of Yuki Tsunoda, and of course has now been signed by Sauber and Audi as well. So for a driver of his age to be kind of headhunted by a team like Audi, that just tells you kind of where his stock currently is in Formula One, especially over qualifying. Yeah, he's been absolutely superb, and also backing it up with plenty of points finishes, which has basically been the backbone of why Haas has been so competitive. So yeah, definitely Nico Hülkenberg, still, even at his age, a quality midfield driver. Next up, of course, the outgoing Valtteri Bottas. I'm actually going to put him in solid but replaceable because, I mean, to be honest, when I look at Valtteri Bottas and his situation, and when I look at solid but replaceable, he is solid but replaceable, unfortunately. He has been replaced at Sauber, maybe a little bit harshly, in my opinion, because I still think he is a very good driver, but he just got caught up in a really horrible situation with the car being as uncompetitive as it is, and it's very difficult when you have a car as bad as the Sauber to kind of show what you can do. But at the end of the day, he has been replaced, so I feel like that kind of is where he belongs at the moment. Unfortunately, he won't be on the grid next season. I feel like he's been performing ever since he's been at Alfa Romeo at a pretty good level, but it's just very difficult because the car is just, since 2022, the car has just progressively got worse and worse, and unfortunately that's had a big impact on, again, kind of the way Formula One sees him. And I feel like that's why Sauber, even though it might have not been fully justified, kind of decided to go with a different direction in Gabriel Bortoleto. Maybe we'll see Bottas back in 2026. I still think he has value to the grid. I mean, again, that's why he's, still in a decent tier, so, he's not useless or anything, which is why I think maybe he is perhaps a bit of an underrated driver. But yeah, unfortunately, he wasn't good enough or seen as good enough by the team to be kept on. Next up, we have Kevin Magnussen, and I'm also going to put him actually in a very similar tier, solid but replaceable. A driver who's had a very colourful kind of 2024. He had an okay 2023. I think he was kind of overshadowed by the return of Nico Hülkenberg, and his seat always looked like it was going to be a little bit at risk this season, especially after how well Ollie Behrman did in his FP1 outing last year, and ultimately it's kind of that's how it's played out. You know, he had a messy, very messy beginning to the season, obviously had a race ban as well, but recently as the Haas has kind of increased in performance, as Haas has kind of found a really nice kind of run of form, he has started to kind of score points as well. So we know K-Mag is, again, a solid driver, but kind of similar to Valtteri, the team has decided to go with a younger driver because they see perhaps a bit more potential for the future. And ultimately, yeah, that's where I think Kevin Magnussen belongs. And I do feel like it's fair to put him kind of one tier below Nico Hülkenberg, because I do think there is a bit of a step between Nico and K-Mag. So I think that's a pretty fair ranking for him. Logan Sargent is next up. Now, he goes in the Latifi tier. Unfortunately, he's going to be the only driver yet again, I think, after last year to be in that Latifi tier, because he just didn't belong in Formula 1. Unfortunately, you know, he had kind of a year and a half. I think James Vowles gave him perhaps even more time than some people expected for him to be given. And even though I do accept that there were things against him, like the whole chassis debacle in Australia, once a team chooses to prioritize your teammate over you when they only have one chassis, that tells you everything you need to know about how much trust your team has in you. So I think his fate was sealed even after that. But then beyond that, not only was there a lack of results, but there was a huge amount of crashes, and crashes that Williams just couldn't afford. So yeah, unfortunate Logan Sargent, he just didn't capitalize. He had a pretty decent opportunity in, I think, a pretty decent Williams. You know, when you look at, you know, the likes of Valtteri and Zhou, who had a terrible Sauber, he had a pretty good car for the past year and a half and wasn't able to capitalize with it. And again, he just didn't look competent enough to be in Formula 1. So that is why he goes in the Latifi tier. Probably the easiest driver on the list. I love the way we go from Logan Sargent to Max Verstappen. I mean, if Max doesn't belong in best of the best, I don't know who does. He is the best of the best in Formula 1. Some people might argue that he is in a class of his own, and I definitely would understand that. You know, I think there's an argument to be made that 2024 is arguably his most kind of impressive championship over the course of his career. You know, he is going to become a four-time world champion, and rightly so. The way he has mentally dominated Lando Norris in my opinion, an inferior car over the course of the entire season. And I think it all kind of gets back to the fact that not only did he dominate last year and had this amazing record-breaking season, but this year is a very different championship compared to last year. This year, you know, he does have competition. He has, you know, Lando Norris, and the fact that I think it was between Miami and Singapore, or Miami and Austin, he did not lose any points compared to Lando Norris in that time frame. That to me was just absolutely crazy. You know, yes, he had that very strong start to the season when the car was quite dominant, but the fact that he lost basically no points between Miami and Austin, that is why he is going to be a four-time world champion. That is why he is the better driver compared to Lando Norris, and the way he continues to dominate Formula 1 and break these boundaries. Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of GOAT discussions when it comes to Max Verstappen, and the way he's been driving, it's easy to see why. So he undoubtedly at the moment, he's not just kind of in the top tier, he is the best of the best in Formula 1. He is the benchmark that everyone is still trying to beat. Next up, we have Esteban Ocon, quality midfield driver, just one of those. Despite maybe the negatives that come with Esteban Ocon, he is sometimes a bit of a controversial driver. He does have that bite to him. He's a bit of a, you know, edgy kind of character, especially in the car, which is such an amazing contrast to the driver and the person that he is out of the car. He seems like such a nice guy, but in the car, the guy is an animal, sometimes to his detriment. We have seen, you know, him and Pierre Gasly, his teammate, kind of lock horns this season. I mean, he has locked horns with a lot of his teammates, but ultimately, he is a quality midfield driver. He is still one of the most dependable drivers out there. I think Haas have got a really, really good lineup with him alongside Ollie Behrman. Next up, we have Carlos Sainz, and he is, to me, undoubtedly in the borderline champions. He's, if anything, to me, he actually kind of epitomizes that tier, because I don't think you can ever say that he is kind of the best of the best. He's not on the level of Max Verstappen, but he really is, in my mind, one of those borderline champions. A guy who is fast enough, both in terms of raw speed and consistency when it comes to, you know, when it comes to kind of racing across the season, and also his technical feedback and his technical know-how, how he works within the team. The fact that he's not really kind of a controversial driver. He's not someone who's gonna, you know, cause a lot of chaos within the team. So yeah, Williams have picked themselves up an absolutely incredible driver, and Carlos Sainz is one of those guys that I think in the right season, and I've kind of talked about this in a recent video, if all of the stars align for Carlos Sainz in the right season with the right teammate and the right level of competition, he could be a world champion in my opinion. I feel like he's quick enough, but yeah, he is one of those drivers where the circumstances would have to be right. But yeah, he's been a fantastic driver for Ferrari for quite a few years, and yeah, unfortunately, just because of the Lewis Hamilton situation, yeah, he's got knocked back down the grid, but that doesn't make him any less of a driver. So yeah, Carlos absolutely is a borderline champion. Next up, we have Pierre Gasly. Once again, I feel like very similar to Esteban Ocon. The thing is, to me, Ocon and Gasly, they're a bit of a much for muchness. Like, I think Gasly got the better of him last year. I think maybe Ocon's been slightly better this year, and it just makes sense. They are so close as teammates. To me, they kind of average out. I don't really have too much more to say about Pierre Gasly. He's just a, very, very solid driver. He hasn't had yet the opportunity to kind of prove that he's in that level with the likes, of Carlos Sainz after, since being dropped by Red Bull in 2019. He hasn't had that opportunity, and I don't think I can put him any higher at the moment. But again, that double podium for the team in Brazil, that was absolutely huge, and it just showed the quality of both of those drivers. On their day, when things align, they can be race winners, as we have seen throughout their careers. And yeah, over the past few seasons, both of them have been super consistent. So yeah, quality midfield drivers feels about right for Pierre Gasly. Next up, Charles Leclerc. Now, this is probably my first big decision here, because for the first time, I think ever, in terms of doing this, I am putting Charles Leclerc in best of the best. I am putting him in the exact same tier as Max Verstappen. That potentially might be controversial to some people because, he is not yet a champion, but I just feel like this season he has gone up a level. He's really got rid of those needless crashes, those mistakes. We know that Charles Leclerc is blindingly quick. I mean, there's an argument to be made that he's arguably the best qualifier on the grid right now, even over the past couple of years. But I think this season he has been undoubtedly one of the drivers of the season, and I'm going to go so far as to say that if you're a really hardcore Charles Leclerc fan and you want to make the case that he has actually had a better season than Max Verstappen, whilst I wouldn't kind of agree with that, I would definitely, I think people could definitely make a case for it. I think he has been that good this season. He is so bloody ready to challenge for a world championship. Ferrari, please give this man the car that he deserves, because yeah, he has got everything now. The speed, the consistency, the quality, the big wins this season. Monaco, Monza, these are high pressure situations that Leclerc has delivered, under high pressure and challenging for a championship. As we have seen this season, it isn't just about the speed, it's about handling the pressure. And yeah, it may be controversial, but Leclerc, for the first time in his career and for the first time kind of in my rankings video, he is to me a top tier driver. And he, in my opinion, despite not having the world championships and the opportunity yet, he belongs to, in my opinion, next to Max Verstappen. So yeah, maybe a bit of a controversial one, let me know. Next up, we have Lance Stroll, and he definitely goes in something to prove. I think, especially after Brazil, he is coming under a lot of heavy criticism, and that doesn't even surprise me, to be honest, because he's one of those drivers where I can't put him in the Latifi tier because he isn't necessarily incompetent. Like, he's not, let's be honest, Lance Stroll is not as bad as Logan Sargent, but at the same time, he doesn't deserve to be in that Aston Martin. He has something to prove. He still needs to prove that he even belongs in the team that he is currently at. We know that he is there because, his dad owns the team, and so, he's kind of got a seat there for as long as he wants, but it doesn't mean that he deserves it. I'm not necessarily saying that he can't do a decent job at a team lower down the grid like a Williams or a Haas, but for where Aston Martin want to get, for where Aston Martin want to be in the future, Lance Stroll just doesn't deserve to be there. And I do think that he is a driver who still, yet again, has something to prove in terms of his long-term future in Formula One, beyond just, having the security of his dad owning the team. So yeah, and he also has these kind of crazy moments, like driving into the gravel in Brazil, which is it's just Lance Stroll, isn't it? So yeah, he definitely belongs in that tier. Next up, we have George Russell, a driver who I think is having a stellar season. Now, here's a very interesting case because I do this list kind of speaking over the last 2 years and looking at the last 2 seasons. George Russell last year did not have a great season. I thought 2023 was actually a very poor season by him, but he has really bounced back. Obviously, with Lewis announcing that he is leaving, that kind of shifts the pressure a lot more on George. He is going to be the team leader at Mercedes going forward up against or alongside Kimi Antonelli as his kind of young teammate, and I think he's really stepped up to the mark. Once again, that Mercedes this season has been so unpredictable. I mean, from track to track, they started the season absolutely terribly. They had that kind of purple patch where they were kind of winning races during the middle portion of the season, and then they're back to being kind of inconsistent. Both of the drivers, even though George is kind of outperforming Lewis, it's not as if he's happy with that car as well. It changes so much that it's frustrating the drivers, but I do think that George has had a really kind of good season under the circumstances, and I feel that's about right. I don't see him yet because he hasn't kind of been given the opportunity to fight up against Max Verstappen, and I also don't think he's quite as good as Charles Leclerc as well. So yeah, he feels like borderline champions. That's about where he deserves to be at this stage of his career. Next up is the driver who has probably been the most talked about driver this season, and that is Lando Norris. He very clearly to me is and has proved that he is in that borderline champions category. He is a very fast and very talented driver, but he is undoubtedly a tier below Max Verstappen. That I think has been proven, and I also think he's a tier below Charles Leclerc. I genuinely believe if Charles Leclerc was in that McLaren, we would see a much closer title fight. Potentially maybe Leclerc would even win it in 2024. I just think with Lando, he is such a talented driver, no doubt about it, unbelievably quick in qualifying, but there's, in this first season where he's really finally been tested up against a driver of Max's quality, we've seen so many cracks in terms, I think, on the mental side, on the driving side. I don't think he's very good wheel to wheel when it comes to those really high pressure situations. And ultimately, I think, this year is only going to be good for him because he's going to learn. He's going to come back a stronger driver in 2025. But there's just no way that, in my opinion, he's anywhere near, at the moment, the caliber of Max Verstappen, and that's the way this season has played out. I think he's had, on average, a faster car than Max, and there's been a very clear gap, in my opinion, between the two drivers. That doesn't mean that he's not going to become a world champion in the future, because, again, he's got the raw materials, he's got the raw speed, but I think this season has been a little bit disappointing relative to what we expected from Lando Norris, and relative to the car that he has had as well. Next up, we have Alex Albon, one of the more maybe difficult drivers to kind of judge on this list, but I am going to go with quality midfield driver. Now, it's interesting because the narrative around Alex Albon the past kind of few years is that, he's carried Williams, and he has, he did an amazing job last year. I thought last season, actually, 2023 was phenomenal by him, but especially with the arrival of Franco Colapinto and then Carlos Sainz in 2025, we are going to find out exactly how good Alex Albon has been, and we're going to find out exactly how good that Williams is as well, because there's no doubt over the past kind of, 2 or 3 years, he has had an easier kind of time of it when it comes to his teammates. I mean, literally, his two teammates are in the bottom tier. There's a tier named after his ex-teammate Latifi, and he was also teammates with Logan Sargent. He dominated both of them, and sometimes that can kind of, that sort of stat padding, it can give us a false sense of security or a false sense of how good this guy really is. And, with Franco Colapinto coming in, it definitely feels like Alex is a little bit rattled. So, I don't feel like it doesn't make me kind of put him in any of the lower tiers. I still think he's a better driver than, for example, Ollie Behrman, Valtteri Bottas, and Kevin Magnussen. But yeah, next year is going to be a very big test, I think, for Alex Albon. But I do think that he kind of belongs in that same kind of caliber with the likes of Hülkenberg, Gasly, and Ocon as well. And so does the next driver, Yuki Tsunoda, one of the most kind of maybe even disrespected drivers on the grid, maybe underrated, not talked about enough. This guy has had basically everyone thrown at him. Nick De Vries last year came in as kind of the next big thing from Helmut Marko, and Yuki Tsunoda beat him. Daniel Ricciardo came in. This season, Yuki Tsunoda beat him. And he's in a really unfortunate situation where he does not have a future in the Red Bull organization, but I do think that he has had another really strong season. I think he belongs with those drivers at that tier because, currently actually he is fighting with Nico Hülkenberg for that best of the rest in the midfield. I think he's maybe like 3 points behind Nico in the championship. Had a really strong race last time out in Brazil as well, finishing 7th. Maybe even could have finished higher had he not got unlucky with the tire change, with the switch from inters to the wets. So yeah, I think Yuki kind of continues to be one of the better drivers in that midfield, but unfortunately, a driver who's a little bit stuck in his situation, and a driver who next year is definitely going to be needing to get out of kind of the Red Bull family. Next up, we have a driver who unfortunately will not be in Formula 1 next year, and that is Guan Yu Zhou. Now, I'm going to put him in something to prove because I don't think he's as good as Valtteri Bottas, and so I feel like it's fair to put him in a category below, but he definitely is not a Logan Sargeant. I do actually feel a little bit sorry for Guan Yu Zhou, to be honest, because he's a driver who came in over the past 3 years, and as he has improved as a driver, as he's gotten better and better and better over 22, over 23, and into 24, the car that he has been driving has only gotten worse and worse and worse. I mean, the best car that he's ever driven in Formula 1 was kind of the Alfa Romeo that he had in his first 6 or 7 races of his career. So when you're fighting that uphill battle of improving as a driver but only getting worse and worse equipment, it is a little bit difficult to kind of, show the best out of yourself and show to the fans and also to the team that you're improving as a driver. At the same time, though, he has been, in my opinion, dominated kind of, forget about the championship because it's hilarious that Valtteri is 23rd and last in a 20-driver championship. He has been, I think, dominated by Valtteri, and so I think it's fair to put him a tier below, but yeah. I think I still feel a little bit sorry for Zhou. I don't think he got the fairest of shots in Formula 1, but yeah, he also got a pretty decent crack and a lot better than a lot of other drivers have had as well. So next up, we have Oscar Piastri. I think it's fair to put him also in borderline champions. Still very rough around the edges. Let's not forget he is only in his 2nd season. I must be honest though, I have to call myself out. I have to be fair. Last year, I had an absolute howler when it came to ranking Oscar Piastri. I think I did my video right before he won the sprint in Qatar, in his rookie season, and I think I had him somewhere in like solid but replaceable last year. So listen, I'm gonna have to take the L. I kind of underrated him. The thing is, I don't feel like I underrated him. It was just that I didn't want to reward him based on something that I hadn't seen yet. But the thing that I find really interesting about Oscar, especially comparing him to Lando, is that, or whilst I don't think that he is as fast or even as consistent as Lando is, and I think that's just going to improve with experience. The more experience he gets, especially next year, he's going to kind of build those things and gain those things. But some of the core qualities that he has, in wheel-to-wheel combat, in his total just ice-cool mentality, that to me is the mark of a future world champion. And I do feel like it's fair to put him with the likes of, Norris, Russell, and Sainz. He is building up to being an incredible driver, and potentially next year, if he keeps on improving, if he finds a little bit more consistency in that raw pace, especially in qualifying, him versus Lando next year is going to be a very, very interesting fight to watch. So yeah, next up we have Liam Lawson, again a driver who's so difficult to judge because you've got what he did last year, in his kind of debut Formula 1 season, so to speak, in the kind of few appearances that he did. And once again, he has been just shoved into the RB in place of Daniel Ricciardo, kind of under a little bit of pressure. Helmut Marko has basically said that Lawson has only been brought in to evaluate him for 2025 and that Red Bull seat. So, that puts pressure on him, that puts pressure on Checo, and I think he's done a good job. I wouldn't say he's kind of been spectacular, he's not kind of immediately come in and just dominated Yuki Tsunoda. I think Yuki is still the better driver out of the two, and so I feel like it's fair to put him so far in solid but replaceable. I think Liam, I really want him to have just a proper preseason, a proper, debut season in 2025 where he can just settle down and he isn't just kind of, randomly put into the car last minute. So yeah, that's where I've got Liam. I look forward to seeing what he can do next year. Potentially, if he has a very good run of races to end the season, he might even end up in that Red Bull for 2025. So yeah, all is still to play, but so far, I don't think I've seen enough to put him any higher than solid but replaceable. And now, next up, we have Franco Colapinto, who I have to be honest, is probably one of the most difficult drivers on this list for me to rank because I really want to put him in that kind of solid but replaceable category with the likes of Behrman and Lawson, but I do feel like as impressive as he has been, and obviously coming in kind of under difficult circumstances, but at the same time with not too much pressure or expectations on his shoulders because, all he had to do is do better than, Logan Sargeant, which he definitely has in just his 2nd ever race. He scored more points in 2 races than Sargeant did in 2 years. So he has delivered and he has been, again, I think the biggest surprise this season. I don't think anyone could have predicted just how well he performed, but the reason why I'm maybe controversially going to put him down in something to prove is that as impressive as he has been, he has also crashed quite a bit. And I think some people kind of, they let that sort of thing slide because he has scored points, and fair enough, he definitely has delivered. But I do think he needs to clean up just a bit more as a Formula 1 driver. Now, again, that's not necessarily a negative. When it comes to drivers like Behrman, Lawson, and Colapinto, these are guys who have just been, they've come in mid-season, so all that it's always going to be kind of not the best circumstances to make your Formula One debut. And as good as Colapinto has been, I think, there are plenty of rough edges for him to kind of improve on. Obviously, he still has kind of the end of this season to really kind of round off as a driver and prove to the other teams that he should be in Formula One. Unfortunately, he just missed out on that Sauber seat for 2025, and so he is going to be on the sidelines next year. But listen, for 2026, he potentially could be an option for plenty of the teams, and it's what he does now in 2024 that's basically going to determine if he is going to be in Formula One in 2 years' time. And next up, we have Fernando Alonso. Now, this is one that I very, very strongly believe in. To me, Fernando Alonso is still in the best of the best category. Now, he kind of benefits from the fact that I do this, again, when I do this list, I kind of look at the past 2 years, and I have not forgotten how good he was last year when he actually had a competitive car. I still think that he is just as good as he was last year, but just the Aston Martin has been very inconsistent. It just has not been anywhere near as competitive as it was last season, and I feel like sometimes people can just really easily forget just how good Fernando Alonso was, last year when he had a very good car, but unfortunately, it was during a season when Max Verstappen had the most dominant car in the history of Formula One. So Fernando has just been unlucky both last year when the car was good and this year when the car was bad. But in my opinion, even at 43, I still believe that he is talented and quick enough to challenge for a world championship. And to me, he is in that best of the best category with the likes of Leclerc and Verstappen. And maybe that will be a little bit controversial to some people, but that's kind of where I see it. And now next up, we have another very, very tricky one, and that is Lewis Hamilton. Now, Lewis again is a driver who definitely is going to benefit this year from the fact that I kind of look at the past 2 seasons in the sense that if I was judging just on their 2024 season, I think Lewis probably would have been, in that borderline champions. But the fact that he had such a good season last year, finishing kind of best of the rest behind the 2 dominant Red Bulls, and also the little kind of, in my opinion, those kind of massive results that Lewis had, winning in Spa and then especially in Silverstone during that really brief period where the Mercedes was actually competitive, that is when we saw the absolute best Lewis Hamilton, the Lewis Hamilton that still can challenge for a world championship in the same way that I think Fernando Alonso can still challenge for a world championship. Maybe in a sense, some people might say that he's quite lucky to still be in that top tier, but from what I saw this season and last season, he still belongs there, but he needs to prove it, next year. Again, it doesn't matter how many championships you win, you are only as good as your last race. And next year is going to be a very big challenge for Lewis Hamilton up against Charles Leclerc, because, if he has a repeat of 2024 and kind of has that inconsistency, especially in qualifying, and isn't kind of able to find the best out of himself at Ferrari, he is going to start slipping down these tiers. But for now, I still believe, and I think I've said this for a third time, if you put Lewis, a motivated Lewis Hamilton, in that McLaren this season, I think he probably wins the championship. He's both him, Leclerc, and Fernando. They are more than strong enough mentally to go up against Max Verstappen. They know what Max is all about, and I feel like when they are in the right environment with the right car and in the right headspace with the right motivation, they are talented enough in that McLaren to be the world champions of this year. So that is why Lewis, to me, is still in the best of the best. Next up, we have Sergio Perez. Now, the thing about Sergio Perez is, and I've said this about a million times on my channel, he is just a driver who is out of his depth. He actually is a good driver. In my opinion, I still think that if you put him in a Haas, if you put him in an Alpine up against the likes of Nico Hülkenberg or Esteban Ocon, where the pressure isn't as high as it is in a Red Bull up against Max Verstappen, to me, he would still be a quality midfield driver, because that is what he has been throughout the entirety of his career. Unfortunately, at the front, up against Max, up against the likes of Leclerc and Norris, he just isn't as good as those drivers, and he has been found out multiple times. Last year when he had the most dominant car in Formula One history, he was able to finish second and kind of avoid some of that scrutiny, but this year, he has been the reason why Red Bull are going to finish third. I don't think the Red Bull over the course of the season has actually been the third fastest, but that is where that team's going to finish, and it is entirely down to him. And then last up, we also have Daniel Ricciardo, and I am going to put him in solid but replaceable, because ultimately that's kind of, I feel like, how good he was this season. I do think he was getting better, you know, as the season kind of went on. He had a really poor start, actually. Yuki was dominating him, you know, early doors in 2024, but despite the fact that he was improving, I know the car was kind of dropping off as well, so he was kind of fighting a losing battle, but ultimately Red Bull just didn't see a future with him, and I don't think he did enough to kind of warrant keeping his seat, and ultimately that's why he was kind of, you know, forced into retirement. So yeah, that is my tier list. That is my F1 2024 tier list. I'm pretty happy with those. I feel like, looking at it, you know, maybe people will say that maybe Checo is a little bit too high. You know, Lewis Hamilton certainly has not been having a best of the best season, but I still believe he has that potential based off what I saw this year and last year. Maybe Franco Colapinto is a little bit low as well. Let me know what you think of my tier list. And once again, do not forget to check out the link in the description to do this tier list for yourself. Anyway, there you have it. If you did enjoy this video and want to support the channel, then don't forget to subscribe. That would be massively appreciated. And I'll see you in the next one.